Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Joint Center's Director of Fellowships and Events, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of what promises to be a very busy and interesting semester of talks, presentations, and panel discussions. Today, we'll be hearing from two of our Gramlich Fellows, students who spent the summer researching, one, looking at manufactured and modular housing being built by community-based organizations on urban infill sites as affordable housing, and the second on efforts to revitalize commercial corridors with a particular focus on a notable initiative in Massachusetts. Before we begin, I want to just say a word about the Gramlich Fellowship and highlight a couple of other upcoming talks. The Gramlich Fellowship is one of our signature fellowships here at the Joint Center. Every year for over 2 decades, it's given 2 Harvard graduate students the chance to explore in some depth a topic of interest to both community-based organizations, particularly those in the network of NeighborWorks America, our longtime partners and funders of this initiative, and also to the researchers here at the Joint Center and other researchers in and out of academia. The students spend the summer researching, they present their findings to practitioners, to policy experts, to the general public, and both Jean and Aaron, who are presenting today, are putting the final touches on papers that will be released later this spring and posted on our website. The application deadline for the next round of the Gramlich Fellowship, i.e. for this summer, is Tuesday, February 18th, about a week and a half from today. If you are a Harvard graduate student who will be returning next fall and are interested in this, I encourage you to look into this. I encourage you to apply. It's a wonderful fellowship. The Joint Center, of course, offers other fellowships which allows students to work in public, private, and nonprofit entities doing interesting work in housing. You can find information about all of those fellowships and the application deadlines, most of which are in mid-March, on our website. I also just want to highlight, we have a really busy schedule of events coming up. Upcoming events in February alone include a talk on understanding and addressing how homelessness affects those who both enter and leave our jails, what policymakers in Greater Boston might learn from the long history of housing cooperatives in Zurich, how financial integration in the US reduced the cost of mortgages and spurred economic growth in the Sun Belt, and what that history might offer to policymakers in the European Union. We're also happy to be supporting 3 student-led conferences open to the public that'll be happening this month. This weekend, in fact, 2 of those conferences are happening at the Kennedy School on the Harvard campus. One, broad look at housing issues and responses both in the US and abroad. The second on urban issues in Latin American cities, including issues related to housing. And then later this month, we're happy to be supporting a conference broadly on policy issues in Mexico, including housing. More information about those events, as well as an equally busy set of events in March and April, is on our website and in our weekly emails. So now on to today's event. As I said, we'll be hearing from our 2 Gramlich Fellows. Our first speaker will be Aaron Smithson. Aaron is a candidate for both a master's in urban planning degree and a master's in architecture degree, which means he brings a very unique perspective that you'll hear in just a minute. Aaron, as I said, looked at how some community-based organizations are using both manufactured and modular housing to build affordable housing on urban infill sites, which seems to be a relatively new development and one that we're very interested in. Aaron's going to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then I will engage in conversation with him, posing questions, most of which I anticipate you will have posed in Zoom's Q&A feature. Apologies in advance, we probably can't get to all of your questions, but we will share them all with Aaron. We'll wrap things up with Aaron somewhere between 12:45 and 12:50, and then turn to our second speaker, who I'll introduce at that time. Usually, as most of you know, we end at 1:15. Given that we have 2 speakers today, I expect we're going to run over probably 5 or 10 minutes. So we'll be off by 1:25 p.m. Aaron, it's all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. I will share my screen and make sure that everyone can see it. All right. So hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. As David mentioned, my name is Aaron Smithson, and I am currently a fifth year at the Graduate School of Design, finishing up a dual master's in urban planning and architecture. And I spent last summer conducting research on offsite construction for affordable housing development on urban infill sites. And this is for a presentation in paper forthcoming, which I am calling Prefab the Gap. So I'm going to start with a bit of an introduction to the concept of offsite construction because it is a theme or a topic that has a lot of jargon and terminology that can be difficult to sift through. So just to ensure that everyone is clear on exactly what I'm talking about, I'll run through a few definitions. So offsite construction is the process by which building elements are manufactured and assembled at a factory before being transported to a building site for installation. And it supports the efficient construction under ideal circumstances of a permanent structure. It's also commonly known by the term prefabrication, hence the title of this presentation. This is as opposed to conventional construction or on-site construction, which entails the sequential assembly of building components at a construction site, as is the case with most multifamily buildings in the United States, also known as stick-built, traditional, or on-site construction. So this would be the majority of buildings that you see being built in the United States today. Offsite construction, as mentioned, has a few benefits, well, several benefits under ideal conditions, including controlled assembly environments, faster construction timelines, and safer work environments. Whereas conventional construction may be more familiar to contractors and lending institutions in the United States, as well as to city governments and architects. There's also a few limits to the height with which offsite construction can be used. So conventional construction can be used for taller and typically more, I would say, customized designs, although some of these things tend to be changing. Offsite construction can then be sorted into multiple different categories. So my presentation will touch on 3 different categories of offsite construction. The main 2 branch offs being manufactured housing, which is commonly known as MH, the acronym, and then modular housing. So just to run through these, manufactured housing is specifically housing that follows the 1976 federal HUD code, including its requirement of a chassis. And it's also referred to as mobile homes or trailer homes in reference to their movability, though some of these terms are in use less now. Manufactured housing tends to be the dominant term. And then modular housing is factory-built housing set on a permanent foundation, not in accordance with the HUD code. So these are buildings that can be stackable. So you can have multiple boxes stacked on top of one another, for instance, or next to one another, composing a much larger building than is possible with manufactured housing under the HUD code. And it typically allows for a little bit more design customization than manufactured housing. The benefits of manufactured housing, on the other hand, are typically that they incur more substantial cost savings, and that the streamlined federal code, basically, it's the only federal building code in the United States right now, and that allows for uniform regulations across all states and jurisdictions. And then within modular housing, there are 2 different sort of types as I have understood them. So this is where we get in total 3 types of offsite construction. The first modular type is 2D or panelized, where flat components such as walls and floors are built in a factory and assembled on site, sort of like pieces in a puzzle. And then there's 3D or volumetric, where wall, floor, and ceiling components are assembled into boxes, usually enclosed on, the top and the bottom, and are assembled into those boxes in a factory and then stacked on site. So the benefits of 2D or panelized construction is that there's typically a little bit more design customization possible than with volumetric construction. And it's also easier to transport to site. So because the components are smaller on the bed of a truck, they can be taken on roads that are typically narrower or more kinked. And then with volumetric construction, you have less on-site work, so potentially greater time and cost savings, which usually does pan out. And you can have pretty large buildings assembled in the matter of a day or two. So just to give a little bit of a visual of what each of these looks like: conventional construction on the left, that's what you will see in most of the United States, and then manufactured housing, assembled in this case, in this image, in a community of manufactured homes. And then you can see a panelized modular example and then a volumetric modular example on the right. So this presentation, once again, will touch on the three on the right. There's also another term in the title of the presentation, infill housing. So I just thought it would be a good idea to define that as I understand it. So infill housing is housing that's developed on vacant or underutilized land, usually in an established urban area. And that typically involves either no demolition of an occupied dwelling or substantial densification of an existing residential lot. So you'll see in each of the examples provided today that they all fit this definition. So in terms of the research question that I sort of came around to by the time I was in the middle of this research last summer, I basically wanted to figure out for community organizations and nonprofit developers, under what particular circumstances does offsite construction for below market infill housing, excuse that typo, make sense, and what are the strategies that maximize its feasibility and affordability. And so I went through several interviews with a bunch of different experts in the field at first to sort of land on this question, and then continued on to stakeholder interviews with a number of people from each of the development teams on the example projects. It was instrumental to attend the HUD Innovative Housing Showcase last summer in Washington, D.C. There were several events focused around manufactured and modular housing. So it was very offsite construction focused, and I was able to see several live built examples in the National Mall of especially of new duplex units that have been approved under the HUD code, as you can see in the two images on the right. And so I am using what basically amounts to a sort of case study method, a series of projects that I'm using to demonstrate strategies that that work, and then also what challenges development teams faced in putting together offsite construction affordable housing. And so these examples or projects are located in 3 states: Rhode Island, Minnesota, and California. I wanted to get a pretty good geographic distribution so that they're all in relatively different both built environments or built contexts, and then also regulatory environments. And so there are 2 examples from Duluth, one from Minneapolis, 2 from Southern California, one of which is in Los Angeles, and the other of which is in San Bernardino, and then one from the Northeast in Providence, Rhode Island. Because this is a slightly abridged presentation for today, I'll be presenting only on 4 of these 6 examples. There were also a few projects that I looked at initially and spoke with several people about that are notable for multiple reasons, including a modular project in Houston for a few duplex homes, and then a pretty large scale manufactured housing project down in Brownsville, Texas, and then a couple of other projects using manufactured housing in Petersburg and Hagerstown in the mid-Atlantic. And those were sort of deemed to be not far enough along an install to warrant study at this point, but could be worth studying for sure in the future. Texas, at the time of my research, was going through a bit of a hurricane situation, so I ended up switching gears to Southern California. So I think that all of these places warrant further examination. And then just in terms of conversations, these are, I think, most everyone that I spoke with. So from both housing experts and then also from development teams. So with each project, I tried to speak to at least 2 different stakeholders, in some cases 3. So with each project, tried to speak to a designer and a developer or member of the developing organization, and then also sometimes a resident, also sometimes a manufacturer. And so thanks to all those people for their time. So I'm going to run through the 4 examples now, and then I'll get to some takeaways at the end. So The first example are a series of community land trust homes in Duluth, Minnesota. This is a really compelling project from a design perspective. I had read about it before sort of diving deep on this, and it has a sort of interesting history. So the project was born out of a competition in Duluth where there's sort of a mismatch between a historic zoning ordinance there that basically makes many of Duluth's existing residential lots undevelopable, because the way that the city was planned was with several lots being, or a large portion of its residential lots being 25 feet wide. And then there was a zoning ordinance that required setbacks from the sides of the lots that were basically too large to make any of those sites buildable. And so there was an update to the zoning, and the city ran a competition to design basically narrow homes for those sites. And so this project was, one of the winners of that competition. And the architects from Office Hughes Olson, Ben Olson and Ryan Hughes, ended up partnering with a local CDC called One Roof Community Housing. And they've, I believe at this point, have still developed 11 of these units on 11 different sites, with more potentially on the way. And the manufacturer for these is modular, which is a local manufacturer out of Minnesota. They are all located on sites that are within One Roof's community land trust. And they're slated for affordable ownership housing at about 60 to 80% AMI, which is, a fairly impressive deal for affordable ownership housing. The prior site conditions were mostly vacant sites, and the houses take on a few different designs, but there are, a couple of templates that they've repeated several times. As you can see, the two houses in this image are the same. The rough total development cost was about $300,000 per unit. Estimated cost savings from the developers was about 30% over conventional construction. And I'll just go through a few more notes on this. They used conventional construction for the first house built on one of these sites, and then from then used panelized construction methods. These are panelized homes. And they're built slab on grade, so there's no crawl space. That basically means that the slab that you see at the bottom of the house on the left is at grade. There's no basement, there's no crawl space underneath that. And so that in some ways simplifies construction. And I will say that there were, I think, some challenges with accessing utility hookups, and there were some sites that had buried foundations and poor soil conditions. So that has, more to do with just site conditions than the actual offsite construction method. But the houses, in many ways fit their context quite well in terms of their shape and their massing. You can see in the bottom left image that the house closely mirrors an existing historic home in terms of its overall form, and then there are different designs. So the one on the bottom right is another design that they've tested on sites that have a little bit more width. And I believe they're mostly occupied. There are a few that are still unoccupied because they're saving them for, I think, indigenous communities. But, we were able to, this was actually kind of a funny story. When we were visiting one of these sites, we were sort of like peering through the windows of one of the unoccupied homes. And then the neighbor from the twin house came out and asked us if we were looking to buy it. And we said no, that we were just conducting research. And she invited us into her home to take a tour of one of the built panelized houses. She was a young public school teacher in Duluth who knew a lot about the way that the system worked in terms of the community land trust, and also had maybe the cleanest apartment or home you'll ever see or be invited to on a whim. So huge thanks to her for the tour. The next project that I'll present on are the scattered site family housing project in Minneapolis. This one was quite high profile in the offsite construction community, and so some of you may have heard about this one. This was initiated several years ago by the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority. So as many people on this call might be familiar, Minneapolis, through its 2040 plan, underwent a huge rezoning in which exclusive single-family zoning was basically prohibited citywide. And so that basically uniformly upzoned a lot of single-family neighborhoods, including many of the ones that these buildings are built in. And so suddenly they had several, the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, which, does own several public housing towers, but also owns, hundreds upon hundreds of single-family home sites, suddenly was able to build up to like 4 plexes, or in some cases 6 plexes, on many of its single-family home sites. And so they underwent, a bit of a study to figure out which sites would be most apt for redevelopment. They had several that were vacant lots, some that were abandoned homes, and some that were occupied but could be densified. And so this was done in partnership with, this project was done in partnership with DJR Architects out of Minneapolis, and then Rise Modular, which is just south of the Twin Cities. And they basically did a study where they identified in the end 16 sites where they could build 4 plexes and 6 plexes, and created 2 template buildings, 1 4-plex and 1 6-plex. You're looking at the 4-plex right now. This is a 4-unit building, and basically repeated those buildings across all 16 sites, producing a total of 84 units. And so the construction timeline in total ended up being, I believe there were some delays in the site preparation, which drove them into winter. So they did have to, winterize their sites to preserve them for install. And then install was sort of logistically challenging because they had so many sites. So teams would move from site to site. Site prep teams would move from site to site, and then install teams would move from site to site as each part of the process progressed. And so the 4 plexes, like the one that you're seeing right here, are composed of 6 total boxes. So there's units on either side. If you can see my cursor, there's a unit on this second floor here on the left, and a unit on the bottom left, and then a unit on the bottom right, and a unit on the top right. And then the central 2 boxes are for circulation. The stair core is in there, and then also service spaces for the units. So bathrooms and I believe laundry facilities are concentrated inside the middle 2 boxes. So those are the only 2 boxes that have significant service infrastructure in them. The total development cost ended up being about $643,000 per unit, which led to about a 0% hard cost savings. However, the estimated time savings over conventional construction was about 5 months. And so time savings by nature leads to cost savings, for instance, because they saved a substantial amount of money on interest during that period. Yes, so you can see that the 6-plex is a larger building, same rough composition, where the middle 2 or the middle 3 boxes host a lot of the service and circulation spaces. And you can see that the colors change, or the sort of accent colors change between buildings. This was based largely on neighborhood, so they picked colors based on neighborhood context and identity. And all units are occupied today. The other key part here in terms of cost savings and not leading to cost overruns was that because a lot of the labor happens in factory, there are fewer positions on offsite construction projects that are required to be paid prevailing wages. There were some complications with lowest bidder requirements for public projects, but we can discuss that later. And we can see that, a lot of these sites are nicely manicured, and that the buildings, despite being larger than some of their contexts, do fit other aspects of their context. You can see in the image on the left that there is another, multifamily 3-story building across the street. This project called Homes by NPHS, which is the Neighborhood Partnership for Housing Services, is located in the Inland Empire in Southern California. So this is a community that has faced a lot of surging housing costs recently, and a booming population, which has led to somewhat of an affordability crisis that's kind of percolating out from the Los Angeles area. And so NPHS has used manufactured housing to go into a lot of underdeveloped sites or sites that they've acquired to basically provide more affordable housing options to residents in the area. So this project used multiple manufacturers. I believe there's a total of 4 factories in use by NPHS locally. And the total number of units installed at the moment is 14. Total number of sites, I believe, is 13 or 14, because the one that you're seeing right now is actually a site where they have a manufactured home in the foreground, which you can see the corner of. That's a cross-mod house, and then an ADU, which is also manufactured in the back, where you see the carport. And these are all deed restricted ownership housing, except that there are a few rental units. I believe the ADU is a rental unit. And so 8 of the units are in San Bernardino proper, and then 6 are in Palm Springs. And yeah, so I'll show a few more images. Well, first, the total development cost. I believe this includes land costs in some cases was about $450,000 to $479,000 per unit. Estimated cost savings over conventional construction for Southern California was about 30%. And then you have some, like site work and landscaping work. These are all built on permanent foundations. So they do have crawl spaces. You can see that the foundations were sort of blended into the homes using cladding. So you can't really tell that they're manufactured houses sitting on foundations with a crawl space. NPHS has sort of become a dealer of manufactured homes. So they work across, it is 3 local factories. And those foundations do hide the sort of chassis of the structures. Yeah, and they take about 9 to 30 days to manufacture in total. And then once the home is installed, there's actually about 1 week of work to complete all the bolting and the cladding and the interior finishes. This was actually something that changed my perception of a lot of manufactured housing on infill sites, is the amount of on-site work that they can do to sort of bring the housing in line with local context, or make it blend into its community more fully. They can do even things like stucco, the exterior walls. But yeah, you can see some examples of cladding here. And then I think what's key in this neighborhood is that a lot of the context is already, single family ranch homes. So the manufactured housing, like the one on the left, actually fit quite closely with the neighborhood as is. This is sort of key to not, precipitating a lot of pushback from community on manufactured homes, because there is this sort of a stigma around them. And they work so well in the neighborhood that actually for-profit developers have started using manufactured homes, in this case, not to increase affordability, but to boost the sort of bottom line. So you can see some examples of market rate housing that uses manufactured housing methods here, also in the same neighborhood. The last example that I'll quickly go through are the Bowdoin Street Row homes in Providence, Rhode Island. This is a series of 8 units developed by One Neighborhood Builders, which is a local community development corporation, in 2022. The site used to be occupied by, I believe, 2 to 3 triple deckers that had burned down in 2017. So the city took over the site and then asked One Neighborhood Builders to develop affordable housing on it. It is affordable rental housing at 50 to 80% AMI, and the construction timeline in total was about 8 months, so significantly less than you might see for conventional construction. Total development cost was about $285,000 per unit. Estimated cost savings over conventional construction about 16%. I think what's really interesting about this project is that it fits so well with its context, despite being modular. I maybe I'm biased, but I don't believe that you can tell that this is a modular building when you look at it. There are some modular buildings that you can sort of tell, but I think that the designers and the manufacturers did a great job of sort of blending these in. What's interesting is that this one was actually manufactured by Champion Homes, which is a very famous and large-scale manufactured housing manufacturer based out of Pennsylvania, but they also have an Excel Homes brand that does modular housing. And yeah. So just to go through some takeaways that I can leave on the screen if anyone has questions about them. Some key ones are that early team formation and strong working relationships between all team members from the outset are key. Geographically proximate manufacturers substantially reduce risks of delay and transport complexity. So crossing state lines increases complexity, obviously, and consistently high demand for modules is needed to attract and retain facilities in the community. So that can be something that complicates that process. Build context is critical, as I mentioned before, in terms of what fits in a neighborhood. Time savings, as I mentioned, often lead to cost savings. So even if there are 0% cost savings on a project, I still had some developers saying that they would consider doing this again, given that they had pretty substantial cost savings off of those time savings. Offsite construction can reduce neighborhood disruption through shorter construction timelines. So there really were no serious examples from these case studies of neighbors pushing back on the fact that it was offsite construction. You might get pushback on affordable housing development, but offsite construction can actually speed up construction processes. So it can be marketed as a tool to make the construction less disruptive to communities, and can actually maybe build support for affordable housing development that way. Newly approved manufactured duplexes, as I showed in that slide on the HUD conference, are particularly well suited to infill sites. And that's because the duplexes have like two utility hookups, or they need two utility hookups that are obviously adjacent to one another. And a lot of manufactured housing communities or mobile home parks aren't set up to support two adjacent utility hookups. Yeah, and then a lot of team members have in many of these examples improved design customizability, and I think that it's really impressive to see what people are able to do in terms of putting gable roofs on modular buildings now. I was surprised by a lot of that innovation. Imperceptibility is the central objective in most factory-built housing projects. So residents of the buildings themselves that are engaged with during the development process express less interest in construction method than in the spatial and material quality of units. So I think the goal on the part of a lot of these development teams was to make it imperceptible as a factory-built home or apartment. Public developers with lowest bid procurement methods sometimes may face difficulty in financing factory-built projects due to higher upfront costs. Though some lending institutions are adapting, we've heard about a few that are beginning to understand the offsite construction process a little bit better. And finally, in terms of the regulatory environment, there are some stakeholders that support the establishment of a federal modular code to streamline construction and permitting processes similar to what the HUD code does for manufactured housing. That is the end of my presentation, so I'll conclude here, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Aaron, thank you. I mean, really a tour de force. We only have time for a couple of questions, so I'm gonna pick and choose here with apologies. There are a couple of folks who were curious both about energy efficiency and related in terms of structural integrity, the ability to withstand severe weather events. Did you have any information on that?
Yeah, I think that there is a perception, especially with manufactured housing, that they are less stable structures than conventionally built homes. I think in the examples shown here, none of them are in sort of serious flood zones or areas that deal with a lot of hurricane force winds. So they weren't contexts in which developers were highly concerned about that. I can imagine that there might be issues with putting any housing in certain areas of the country that do deal with some of these more serious environmental issues. But I think in general, the quality of construction has improved a lot. There have been updates to regulations within the HUD code about durability and the sort of sturdiness of these buildings. And so I think that you'll see that a lot of manufactured homes that are manufactured today, as opposed to ones manufactured, for instance, in the 1970s or 80s, are actually, practically equally as strong as a lot of site-built homes. And then in terms of energy savings, I think, there's one part of this is that in terms of, the climate crisis in housing is that there's actually a lot of reduction in waste from offsite construction. So there's kind of like an embodied carbon benefit to using these methods because, working in a controlled environment means that you can, cut things to size. You can use super precise methods to prepare materials, and then there's also less exposure to the elements, so there's less risk of loss of material during the construction process, and so that can be really critical. And then, also that there are some, when you're working in a factory environment, you can also, I guess, have even greater precision in terms of the construction process than with on-site construction. And so there are, certain tools that manufacturers are using now to, like use more sustainable materials in the construction process, and then also ensure that, sealants are used in a more efficient way even than with on-site construction. So I think the sort of energy saving potential is multifaceted.
And one of the striking things about this project, and we've spent a lot of time talking about it, was when you started the research, we weren't sure that there was going to be significant infill, and the fact that it was going on and that you found it, as you pointed out in your opening, several, in a bunch of different locales and different types of markets. There are a bunch of questions that I think pick up on that, saying, are there policy changes or other practical changes that you can think of that might sort of further spur this along? And if so, do you have a sense of where those are at? I guess one of that might be the sort of uniform code, but your
Yeah,
thought.
I think, a uniform code is sort of debatable. Some stakeholders would express that they would love to see that, and some express that they, have some trepidation about it. I think in some cases, some development teams that have used modular construction methods sort of like the customizability and like being able to kind of like work closely with designers and residents to design to certain specifications. But then, of course, it would be much easier regulatory in terms of the regulatory environment to get buildings built across state lines, to have manufacturers working across state lines and in multiple jurisdictions within a state, even if there were a more uniform code established. I will also say, in terms of manufactured housing, there are still a lot of municipalities, as a lot of research has shown, including from the Joint Center itself, that prohibit manufactured homes from being constructed or installed within city limits. And they do this through a lot of specific design regulations, where they'll, for instance, regulate the pitch of a roof such that they kind of strategically make manufactured housing install impossible within their communities. And I think that a lot of those are sort of short-sighted in a way, and don't acknowledge the kind of design innovations and improvements that have been made in the manufactured housing space in recent years that bring these homes in many cases in line with site-built homes in terms of construction quality and design character. So I think that those are two critical places to start, I would say.
Well, I could go on, and we've got dozens of questions, which we'll share with you, but unfortunately, we're a little bit out of time. I just want to say that this was a really exciting project, as I just mentioned. When it started, we weren't sure there was a there, and it was just very exciting, I think, to really be picking up on a really notable development. I think it's very striking that, even, as you said, even where there weren't cost savings, and in many cases there was almost always time savings. And if my memory's right from our conversations, many of the folks who did this, I think with one exception, said, yes, we will do this again, which is really the proof of the pudding. And one would expect over time they'd get a little better at it too.
Yeah. Yeah, there are several that are even already doing it again, so it's a good sign.
So thank you for a terrific presentation. And again, apologies to everyone that time is a little bit short. Our second speaker, Jein Park, is also a student at the Graduate School of Design in the Masters in Urban Planning program. As I mentioned earlier, Jein came to us actually with a proposal to look at efforts to revitalize commercial corridors, which are really a critical part of thriving communities. A topic that really intrigued us, and Jean did a deep dive. She will tell you about it. Again, Jean will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll do about 10 minutes of Q&A, and I will do my best to end by 1:25, but no later than 1:30. Jean, all yours.
Hey everyone. Thanks for making the time to come to my presentation, Building Resilient Communities, Lessons Learned for Sustained Revitalization of Commercial Corridors. I know that there's a lot of housing people in this room, but I hope my research can still be valuable when thinking about housing in the greater neighborhood context. And I think it would be really difficult to talk about successful housing projects without also talking about the businesses and services that surround the housing and vice versa. So let's get on with this presentation. Just a brief overview of what to expect today. And so to start off, I divided my research into the two phases that you see here. Phase one was focus groups with TDI fellows, and TDI stands for Transformative Development Initiative. And I will get into that in a couple of slides of what that is. And as you can see, the focus groups were divided by topic area of what different gateway cities represented in terms of economic and industry dominance. And the second phase of my research consisted of interviews with leaders of various community development corporations throughout Massachusetts. So I thought it'd be important to quickly introduce the Transformative Development Initiative and Mass Development since they were instrumental in my research. So TDI is Mass Development's place-based economic development program designed to revitalize and strengthen commercial districts in gateway cities on a frame of partnership and community engagement. TDI is not necessarily the first program of its kind, and there are several predecessors, such as the Main Streets program or local business associations. But what makes TDI stand out against these other programs is its unique combination of placing full-time fellows, direct state funding, and its layered approach to capacity building and capital investments. And these elements allow TDI to offer both direct community engagement and flexible financial support, allowing districts to authentically develop solutions tailored for their specific needs and challenges. So this, as I mentioned, there are different gateway cities that participate in this program, and every gateway city is assigned one fellow to one specific commercial district in the city. And the selection process for the fellows is pretty intentional. Fellows come from a wide diversity of backgrounds, with former landscape architects, small business owners, and artists being a few examples. Fellows must demonstrate the ability to engage with diverse stakeholders and manage complicated community projects. And current fellows have described their 3 years of tenure as the first year just getting to know the community and focusing on individualized assistance, the second year focusing on building collective momentum, and the third year continuing to execute on ideas and figure out how their work will live beyond their tenure. Example projects include equity investment, facade improvements, small business microlending, among numerous others. So now I want to introduce NeighborWork America's 7 principles of comprehensive community development, which you can see on this slide because TDI values closely align with these principles. It's a lens through which we can view community development work, and these principles are intended to offer a framework that recognizes complexity and allows for customization. I'll be discussing how the findings from the TDI program strongly correspond with these principles, which are central to building resilience in commercial corridors. Rather than inventing a new language or framework for resilience, I find it more effective to build upon and adapt an existing framework. I hope this slide provides the ultimate clarification of how to communicate the difference between revitalization and resilience. For decades, programs and research have focused on revitalization of commercial districts, many of which are point-in-time strategies and don't respond well to shock events like natural disasters or recessions. For example, will street beautification really hold up in a natural disaster event? So I'm arguing that we need to move on from thinking about revitalization strategies to resilience building efforts with the goal of better absorbing shock events. The rest of this presentation will be talking about what these resilience building efforts may look like. So in my research, I plan to challenge the notion of a commercial corridor revitalization success story when conditions that determine success may be very transient. And ultimately, the big question is what stands in the way of building resilience and what can we learn from TDI and CDCs about overcoming these barriers? And the questions on the left support my main research question. So once again, my key finding and probably thesis of this research is that TDI starts to fill some of the capital and capacity gaps that challenge cities' resilience building efforts, but then the programs expire after 3 years, and communities need continued investment in the systems and networks that build resilience. And once again, this was less of a evaluation of TDI and more about using TDI as an access point into what is and isn't working in communities. I found overwhelmingly that fellows start to fill some of the critical gaps that commercial districts have suffered from. For example, bringing community together to rally around creative projects, providing door-to-door technical assistance, or pulling flexible funding from mass dev that these communities are not used to seeing. I go through the section detailing some of the shoes that CDCs may not be able to fill due to the lack of capital or capacity. Many of the efforts that fellows bring to life could set precedents for long-term resilience building efforts. And I want to emphasize that TDI is not meant to be a replication of a community development corporation. Rather, it is an experiment where MassDev tries to understand the talent, resources, and network gaps that many communities have and how TDI can start to fill some of these gaps, especially in cities where presence of community-based organizations is weaker. In cities where community development corporations, which I'll abbreviate CDC in the following slides, coexist with TDI programs such as Lawrence and Lowell. They often work in partnership to complement each other's strengths. And in this partnership, TDI often provides financial and technical assistance in addition to intrastate networks, while CDCs provide access to key contacts within the city due to the trust and relationship building that CDCs have already accomplished over several years, sometimes decades. And CDCs also have heightened cultural awareness and sensitivity in these cities, which are dense with communities of color that TDI is more limited to. This slide details some of the projects that illustrate how TDI fellows have been tackling challenges and building opportunities. They vary in creativity and length of impact. The one-off projects are more representative of revitalization strategies, which again are important, but maybe not enough on their own. As we move towards the middle, medium, and longer-term projects, that's where we really start to build a picture of what resilience building efforts might look like. What we find from these projects is that they really do respond to real-time needs of communities that community development corporations don't have the capacity or funding to do. The gaps that TDI helps fill can be categorized into the buckets of resources, engagement, and possibility. TDI fills critical gaps for CDCs by providing flexible funding and technical support, ensuring small businesses can cover essential costs like utilities and navigate storefront improvements. Beyond direct financial aid, its flexible funding enables creative, place-based investments such as Springfield Fashion Week, which connected fashion industry talent and revitalized vacant spaces. TDI also bridges the engagement gap by fostering trust through direct relationships with business owners, particularly immigrant entrepreneurs, ensuring their voices shape economic development. In Pittsfield, fellows led streetscape projects that improve downtown aesthetics while strengthening relationships with business owners. TDI's hyper-local relational approach builds community-driven initiatives like connecting youth to the Berkshire Innovation Center or revitalizing an abandoned movieplex in Attleboro, reinforcing that stakeholders are active in the change. And lastly, rather than introducing new frameworks, TDI strengthens existing networks, amplifying the work of CDCs and community-based organizations with flexible experiential capital. Its bottom-up model built on trust, collaboration, and incremental change demonstrates that transformation is possible when communities have the tools, support, and belief to bring their vision to life. So the resource and engagement gap are often obstacles to CDCs that feed into an issue that risks being larger than the sum of its parts, which is the possibility gap. And this gap is both psychological and systematic, and prevents communities from believing in and acting on change. And this is often reinforced by disinvestment and neglect. A CDC director that I talked to in my research noted that growing up surrounded by abandoned buildings can lead residents to internalize stagnation, making change seem impossible. This skepticism extends to institutional actors like banks and developers who often lack faith in investing in struggling neighborhoods. And overcoming this gap is not an impossible feat, but does require shifting both individual and collective mindsets. So as I've identified the gaps that many CDCs say limit their work and impact, the resources, the engagement, and the possibility, we'll start to introduce how to make sense of this data in terms of the lessons that organizations can learn to better build resilience in their districts. Because revitalization strategies are often point-in-time solutions that don't always consider long-term sustainability, it's crucial to consider how the work TDI starts in their districts can live beyond the 3-year program tenure. By addressing gaps in resources, engagement, and possibilities, TDI's approach illuminates how CDCs can benefit from additional talent, tailored support, and collaborative effort. One CDC director aptly summarized the notability of TDI's absence after their program expiration by saying, quote, "Our TDI fellow was super connected to all of the business owners and organizations. They were a glue and knew all the business owners by name and had time to connect with them. Ever since they timed out, we've been missing that." And on the contrary, from the fellows' perspective, they know it's an amazing model when you have the right people in partnership to work together with a combination of ingredients like priorities, interest, and reliability, and understanding that shared resources will have greater impact. So this is to highlight the difference once again between revitalization and resilience in terms of what they tend to focus on and how the approaches might slightly differ between the definitions. Revitalization and resilience share key similarities in that they try to solve for in districts, but revitalization focuses on enhancing conditions of a district, particularly in areas of disinvestment or decline, while resilience focuses on building the capacity of a district to withstand, adapt to, and recover from adverse shock events like pandemics, recessions, and natural disasters. Revitalization often achieves its goals through redevelopment, improving public spaces, supporting local businesses, and/or attracting new businesses. But resilience also takes on those efforts while also being mindful of emergency preparedness plans, strengthening support ecosystems, and investing in resilient infrastructure. So once again, we have to move beyond point-in-time strategies and focus on investing in the systems and capacities that support resilience. And I know that was a bit of a loaded statement, but we actually don't have to start from scratch because, again, there's already a framework to build resilience that exists. And I mentioned NeighborWorks CCD principles, comprehensive community development principles earlier. And when analyzing the multiple hours of conversations I've had with fellows and CDC leaders, I realized that these principles actually prove themselves to be a North Star in laying the groundwork for systems change in the communities that they worked in. So I've grouped the 7 principles into 3 umbrellas. 1 is community-driven foundation, 2 is alignment and priorities, 3 is sustained capacity building as the key ingredients to building resilience in communities. These principles are often aspirational, but what TDI has shown is that these programs are actually achievable if they had enough attention and investment. These principles also form the bedrock of what makes a community resilient as opposed to just revitalized. What I learned from resilience is that it can't exist without a community-driven foundation. Resilience isn't just about infrastructure, but also ensuring that the people most affected by ongoing challenges and shock events are actively involved in shaping their future. As we know, or as many of us know, gateway cities often struggle with economic stagnation, underbanked immigrant communities, and disinvestment, making trust building both essential and difficult. And trust builds with consistency and commitment with visible results and shoulder-to-shoulder scenario planning. It's important to highlight that TDI fellows are not the experts and that the expertise actually lies in the community members. So it's important that the community members feel dignified in the knowledge that they hold. Disenfranchised communities are not used to being heard, and building a community-driven foundation of resilience begins with honoring the ears, eyes, and voices of the people who walk and live this neighborhood streets every day. A city can have all the resources, time, and people, but still get little done without alignment and priorities between multiple stakeholders. Without clear, unified leadership and a sense of shared values, resilience building efforts risk becoming fragmented, which undermines the collective capacity to respond to challenges. I remember one fellow noted in our conversations that it should be on the city to be the thunder in taking charge of coordinated leadership, particularly because small business owners are often already overwhelmed with running their businesses. But in the TDI program, the fellows had the opportunity to serve the role as facilitators, but this responsibility required clear assignment from day one to avoid mismanagement and the risk of lost momentum. The one example is that in Springfield, the fellow noticed a broad community partnership that lacked a backbone, and they piloted a model for a leadership council that sought to establish a more equitable table by acknowledging the roles that people are able to play. So resource-rich institutions, community-rooted organizations, and residents and small business owners were all able to take part in this leadership council, and the residents and business owners received stipends for their time. Lastly, sustained capacity building sets resilience apart from revitalization. The most adaptive commercial corridors invest in organizations, people, and infrastructure over time. It's not just about immediate fixes, but also integrating physical, financial, and social infrastructure to stay innovative. This requires both short and long-term investments in human and infrastructural capacity. As an example, Revere pursued this through a capital absorption framework, ensuring that the city could manage and leverage incoming resources for lasting impact. This meant creating a community percent of new development revenue, advocating for community benefits agreements, and using ARPA funds to test key projects, and also issuing no interest loans through community development block grant funds. Since securing funding can feel like a full-time job, investing in staff dedicated to capital absorption strengthens communities' abilities to sustain long-term resilience building efforts. Oops, I went a little too far. So now we're going to conclude with some reflections and recommendations on how to make sense of what are the next steps with all this data that I provided. And resilience, once again, is built on a consistent presence of key conditions that can be tailored to any community context. And we discuss community-driven foundations, alignment and priorities, and sustained capacity building. So these are some of the scalable best practices that I identified attached to the 7 comprehensive community development principles. These practices emerged from a combination of recommendations that TDI fellows would give to communities wanting to replicate their efforts. The audience is rather broad. This can be advice for CDCs that are looking for feasible and actionable next steps. It could also be for municipalities looking to strengthen their community development departments, or for any relevant organizations to use as advocacy tools for funding from local and state governments. And so I want to make sure that these best practices were actually achievable and something very doable. For example, one untapped resource is the youth and schools in an area, and I found that collaborating with local students on creating an emergency preparedness plans can kind of be a win-win in terms of giving students an opportunity to really think about how do we protect the future of our community while also relieving CDC or community-based organization staff of putting all of the to-do lists on themselves. The slide continues with the last 3 comprehensive community development principles. And yeah, just I think one thing to really take away from all of these best practices is that you really need to identify the quarterback organization to drive a lot of these efforts, because if the roles and leadership isn't clear from day one, then the efforts can get very muddled. And without a clear backbone to continue the momentum, it's really easy for efforts to falter and fall through the cracks. So another question I asked in my focus groups with TDI fellows is if you could reinvent or change what the TDI program, as you know, what would you maintain or what would you introduce? And there were so many elements that the fellows thought already worked, which was, really being the eyes and ears on the ground, as well as the flexible grant funds they were able to deploy quickly, and the cultural sensitivity that they were trained to have in doing their work. but they wish that there were more clear transition plans and that a 5-year minimum tenure versus the 3 years it is currently would really help introduce those transition plans and figuring out how their work lives beyond their time. Focusing on the capital absorption piece to make sure their work is financially sustainable, as well as a formal space for fellows to coalesce together and reflect together, because a lot of them were pretty grateful for the focus groups being their opportunity to listen to each other on what they've been working on, what's worked, what's challenging, and build ideas together. So if there's anything I'd like you to take away from this presentation, it's that to cultivate conditions for building a resilient commercial corridor, there must be strong networks, sustained funding, a sense of agency, and belief in hope and transformation. Resilient commercial corridors aren't just about what gets built or funded. They're about changing the way communities engage, access resources, and build long-term networks. Mass Development's TDI program has demonstrated this possibility in many different contexts. They fill critical gaps in municipalities, particularly in their community engagement and flexible funding efforts, but lack the permanence that can help districts sustain resilience building efforts. Therefore, it's crucial to explore how existing institutions and community networks can complement and strengthen the capacity of CDCs and community-based organizations as they are uniquely positioned to carry this work forward. And thank you so much for your listening.
Jein, thank you. And again, just a tour de force, really. Just before I start, several folks have asked in the Q&A about posting of both slides and videos. We will be posting a video of this event, usually by early next week. Not sure about the slides because both Jein and Aaron are in the process of finalizing their papers. And so we're having a discussion about whether we want to wait till we actually post the papers, which will be sort of the final word on this. So yes, on the videos, stay tuned on the slides. And then back to some questions. I was struck by your sort of calling out the importance of a quarterback organization. And it particularly made me think, could you talk a little bit about the relationship between the TDI fellows who are there for a limited amount of time and being funded by the state, and whatever these varying communities had in terms of a planning or community development department? So both what was the relationship, but more broadly, was there any consistent, what are some examples of entities that wound up being the quarterback organizations?
I think what was particularly striking about these cases is that often the communities lacked a quarterback organization. I kind of sped through the slide where I talked about which community development corporation leaders I was able to talk to, but a lot of the gateway cities actually don't have active CDCs in place, which is why it was really difficult to talk to CDC leaders in each of the gateway cities that I was able to use in focus groups. And so the TDI fellows ended up becoming that quarterback organization and showing communities and even cities what was possible, because a lot of the existing entities, which is primarily the municipality and the city government, is so overwhelmed with, there's so many fires to put out, but so little funding and so little support that a lot of the TDI fellows just helped really step in and help put out a lot of those fires. But I think that returns to the question of how do we make sure this work lives beyond them? Because as I think it was Pittsfield or some other gateway city, but they really noticed the absence of the TDI fellow after their program expired. And so I think it really highlights, is this something that mass development or a similar agency can help institutionalize in cities that need the support the most?
Question about to what extent, I'm going to morph the question a little bit, but to what extent did issues related to displacement and potential gentrification, particularly low income and minority residents, come up? And was there anything about the TDI process in your mind that made it particularly well suited for addressing some of those concerns?
Right. I think this is actually a really good question, because For a program that was so focused on place-based investments, I feel like in traditional discourse about these programs, it always comes with concerns of gentrification displacement, but that actually rarely emerged in my conversations and focus groups, if at all. I think because the districts have to be at a point of evolution to, you know, to have gentrification happen, to have that be a realistic possibility as well as this displacement. But I think so many of these districts are so far from being in that place of, like we have the possibility of gentrifying that it didn't emerge as a conversation piece because it was really about like, how do we first fill these buildings? How do we beautify the streets? How do we like this university has really shut down post COVID and we've lost so much foot traffic from it. Like, how do we bring those people back? I think the questions were too in the fire and in the heat of the moment to even think about gentrification at that point. But just as another note, a lot of these local actors were very mindful of being community first. And there was an example I didn't have time to include, but in one of the gateway cities, a group of Latino small business owners actually eventually became landlords and invested in revitalizing a block altogether, but they were really sensitive about, the community needs and kind of created naturally occurring affordable housing and rents that way, in addition to being really thoughtful about what tenants to put in place. And so I think a lot of the people who do have the power to revitalize these blocks are being really mindful about how to do it in a sustainable way that it really serves the immediate needs of the community.
It actually morphs into the question I was about to ask you, which was, are there particularly good examples of the work, in your mind, the work where the TDI program officially ended, but had left enough bones to go on? And the related question to that is, does Mass Development, which is the state entity that oversees TDI, provide any kind of ongoing resources to folks who've been through the TDI program?
Right. So I think because a lot of the TDI fellows that I spoke to were in an active program, we don't have the hindsight or opportunity of reflection to think about what was long lasting. And unfortunately, in discussion with the CDC leader who did used to have a TDI fellow, he talked about, how much they're missing that presence, but not about like how their work lived beyond. But I do remember in a conversation with one of the representatives from MassDev that when the TDI program expires, it's not like these cities and districts fall off MassDev's radar, because they built relationships and because they were able to, really become present on MassDev's radar of like the districts that we need to support. A lot of the organic relationship building that happened during the program continue to support the districts after the program, but I can't recall any specific examples that speak to it at the moment, just because that didn't come up in the focus groups.
Well, as is always the case, we have less time than we do questions. Just to reflect for a minute, the Gramlich Fellowship is a really remarkable, I think, experience because we basically find, as you've seen, wonderfully talented students who often raise questions or see things that we hadn't seen, and give them an opportunity to really dig deep. Our partnership with NeighborWorks really allows folks to often short circuit the processes that just take time to get into a network and understand it. Again, as I said at the beginning, if you're a Harvard graduate student or a Harvard graduate student who's interested in spending the summer really doing a deep dive with both practitioners and researchers on issues related to housing and community development, this is your fellowship, and the application deadline's coming up. The other thought I had, I was very struck at the end of Jane's presentation that the key to success was strong networks, sustained funding, a sense of urgency and belief that you could and hope that you could do stuff. And I was reflecting that in some ways, that also characterized all of the projects that Aaron described. And again, it's why I think the Gramlich Fellowship is so special, because every year we have the opportunity to go out and learn what people are doing on the ground, often really exciting things, and things that the rest of us, both in the research community and the practitioner community and in the larger civic community, can learn from. It's just a testament to the importance of continuing to be out there and continuing our work to make sure that we're engaging and supporting the students who will be the next generation of housing leaders. I thank all of you for joining us. I hope you will join us for future events. And as I said, you can see the full list on our website. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Thanks a lot.